this pastor in one of his sermons called trans advocacy emotional terrorism.
Some parents, you may have this sentence wielded at you. You can either have a living son or a dead daughter. That is emotional terrorism.
My parents actually sent me a link to this sermon when I came out as trans. I used to be a Christian, am no longer a Christian, but somehow they thought that this might help from me understand it from a biblical perspective. In reality, there's nothing in that sermon that I hadn't already known or understood. And in the end, I lost my parents because they refused to use my name and pronouns. And now I don't have any contact with my parents anymore. They're really more or less dead to me, which is one of the most painful things I've ever experienced in my entire life. And I don't know if I will ever talk to them again or communicate with them again. Hopefully, they would need to do some pretty serious repair work on their end of the relationship for that to happen, but I guess I'm technically hopeful. I just don't ever expect it. I think we can do better than this though. There has to be a way for Christians and trans people to exist in the world together. We're neighbors, we're friends, we're family or whatever. Like, we have to be able to handle that. I do understand the complexities of what my parents are dealing with. I mean, I used to share a faith with them. In fact, our theology was very closely aligned, and I don't necessarily blame them in that aspect. I just, losing a parent is really hard. So I know that people like my parents place a very high value on truth. There's like a lowercase t truth and an uppercase T truth. So the uppercase T truth is Jesus, and the lowercase t truth is like that facts and that kind of thing, things that comport with reality. I also know that transitioning is against their faith. In fact, all LGBT communities are against their faith. That's living in sin. That is against God's perfect order. It is ultimately going to backfire and cause me to hurt myself worse in the long run. It's going to send me to hell because I don't believe. But I'll go to hell anyway. I'm an atheist, so whatever. If hell is real, then I guess that's where I'm headed. And I also know that they probably don't understand why. Why did I transition? Why do I think of myself as a woman? They knew me as a kid, and they knew, even in their messages to me after I came out to them, they described, I just don't think this is you. I did all of these things. This is what I observed about you as a kid, etc., etc., etc. Of course, I have a different perspective on that than they do, but understandably they are confused as to why this is happening and if I really feel this way. They don't share that internal experience of my mind to understand what I'm going through. In their view, it's God's word against the world. They think the Bible is essentially anti-trans. The truth is, that's really more of a interpretation. So that is an understanding of what the text means that they have applied to that text for a variety of reasons. That's the tradition that they grew up in. That's they maybe some logical reasoning. They take some other passages, kind of mash them all together and come up with anti-LGBT, anti-trans logic to that. Ultimately, at the end of the day, this is an interpretation of the Bible, perhaps led by the Holy Spirit, which I don't think exists, but I don't really see this in the Bible. And it's not for lack of reading. So the image of God is the most common reason that is given that the Bible is against transgender.
Then God created. So the physical part of you, the Bible says, is not meaningless. That your body was created by the living God. Oh, and by the way, not just created, but infused with glory, because he created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them.
But here's the thing about that passage, and all of the creation narrative in Genesis chapter 1, it has all of these dichotomies that aren't actually one or the other. There's always shades between them. Like night and day. Like there's dusk and dawn and all these other shades between night and day. When it's creating the land animals and the bird animals, well, there's all sorts of species of animals that are neither land nor water animals, or there's like penguins are birds that flightless birds, ostriches are flightless birds, etc., etc. There are things that are not just neatly in these two categories. What I think that this passage is trying to communicate is that God created the entire gamut of reality, that God created all the way from night to day, from land animals to fish, from birds to animals, like the whole bit. I think that is a more faithful interpretation of what is going on there. I also see a lot of LGBT representation. Joseph in the many-colored coat, like there's some very gender non-conforming vibes to that story, and I won't go into details here, but there's also David and Jonathan were very gay. So there's tons of other examples too, and some of them kind of go back to like understanding what the original Greek and Hebrew said, but ultimately, like, I understand that my parents are not going to accept my interpretation of the Bible. I just want to emphasize that it is an interpretation. And I wish that they would have more space for understanding that they might be wrong about the way that they've interpreted the Bible. Certainly, I don't think that they would say that they've interpreted everything in the Bible correctly. They wouldn't call themselves infallible in that regard. So I just want there to be more wiggle room for them to say, well, this is what I believe, but I'm willing to entertain the idea that maybe I'm not fully correct in my understanding there. One other thing I wanted to say on the image of God is, like, the image of God is put into man and woman, the man and the woman in the Garden of Eden. That means that God encompasses all of maleness and femaleness. And the entire range between maleness and femaleness is contained within God, because that male and female relationship is made in the image of God. So God is traditionally thought of as has masculine pronouns in the Bible. Is God more non-binary and all-encompassing? And so if it makes sense that God would encompass this entire gamut of range from all the way from man and to woman, would not that also imply that there are people at different points along that spectrum? I mean, I think so. Again, my parents are not going to take my interpretation as word. I'm an atheist, so ultimately I don't have any say in how they believe the Bible. It seems like a very gross misunderstanding of kind of the themes that are running through the Bible and what the text implies to me. I wanted to lay out a few lowercase t truths that are definitely like measurably correct. Without support, trans kids, and like we're talking all the way from young children all the way into adults, without support, those children have the highest rates of suicide. Those kids of those parents have the highest rates of suicide without family support. If the parents are neutral supporting, or the family is neutral supporting, then there drops. If the family is actually supportive, then it drops even more. And that is a fact. Like, we can measure that. That is fact. We have data to back that up. You can't say that that's not true. You can misinterpret the data.
In fact, some studies are now showing that rates are higher after gender-affirming care is given.
The lower rate with after transition and with acceptance is still not as low as the cis population. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, like, the minority stress of living in a nation and living in a world that does not accept you, that fundamentally does not accept you. My life is in danger on a daily basis. I could just walk out of my apartment someday and some random stranger could just attack me out of the blue just because I'm trans. And all of this rhetoric, anti-trans rhetoric, and this hate that's in the media also wears on you. So to say that rates are higher after transition is a lie. That is wrong. It is factually incorrect. It is true that after transition, it's still higher than cis people. But cis people are largely worldwide accepted. When this pastor says this, he's just wrong. Either that or he's lying to you. I do think he's been very irresponsible with the actual data. A good chunk of this sermon is talking about Abigail Shrier's work.
Abigail Shrier, her book Irreversible Damage. Abigail Shrier, an Ivy League educated non-Christian sociologist, journalist, and researcher, she says that transgenderism among adolescents right now is contagious. That her word is actually becoming an epidemic spread by two means. Number one, immense social media immersion, primarily TikTok. And then relationships. It's like young adolescent girls that want a sense of identity and worth. They want to be celebrated. They view it as a way to receive affirmation and sort of inclusion and honor and that sort of thing.
That is based on highly biased, invalidated, debunked research. The methods used in that research were not scientifically sound.
It's time to dig down into exactly what is wrong with this research and why ROGD is not a real thing, let alone something that anybody should be using to describe or invalidate any trans person or their experience. Overall, an open letter written by the Gender Dysphoria Affirmative Working Group stated that the study has multiple biases and flaws in methodology and that it's been widely contested as methodologically flawed and unethical, proceeding from an overt ideological bias and is bigotry masquerading as science. In short, and to say it politely, it's a poorly conducted piece of research based heavily on biased personal opinions.
He goes through it in more detail and how the biases of who they asked the question to, the fact that they didn't ask a single trans person, they just asked the parents. They went to groups of parents that were already known to be anti-trans. So they're going to get a certain side of the story. And that's what they're gonna, the report is gonna say. This social contagion is actually not a thing.
And you need to understand this. Over time, this is what usually happens when there's a dysphoria between mind and body. Stats, 61 to 88% of people will age out of gender dysphoria if they're just left alone.
Now, the origin of this 80% desistance statistic originates from a 1995 study by Kenneth Zucker and Susan Bradley, where they found that out of the 45 gender nonconforming children in their study, 80% were not found to be transgender at follow-up in their high school years. Since this was 1995, none of these young people were ever diagnosed with gender dysphoria in the first place, and the sample actually represented a wide spectrum of gender nonconformity, not just those who actually desired to be or insisted they were a different sex or gender. I mean, the study contained kids who did not express desire to be or identification with another gender, but rather just preferred to dress or play differently than those stereotypical of their sex. This was not a sample of exclusively transgender or gender dysphoric kids by today's standards.
The data is very clear. 99% of all people who transition, especially like post-surgery and after a little bit of time, are happier, have no regrets with their surgery and no regrets. Do you understand how high 99% is? Knee surgery, heart surgery, cancer surgery, all these other surgeries have a higher regret rate than transitioning. And so it is not true that it is a social contagion that doesn't stick around after you actually transition. It's not that somebody told me. Nobody told me I'm trans. 0 people. Literally 0 people told me I'm trans. The way that I figured it out is somebody asked me a question. Why do I like to play women in D&D? And now, like, just because you play a woman in D&D doesn't mean you're trans. But it did for me. That's why I was doing it. And it led to this thought process that just like unraveled a whole lot of stuff that made sense all the way back from my very earliest memories in childhood. It is not a social contagion. It is more accepted. And so more people who are trans have come out, have transitioned because it is safer to do so than it was 100 years ago or even like 2 decades ago. If you don't know your kids are trans, if your kids are trans and you don't know it, it's either because they don't know it themselves or they're hiding it from you. In either case, their risk is still higher than the cis population. Like, the negative effects from being trans are present even if you don't know you're trans, even if your parents don't know you're trans. Especially like, oh my gosh, the period of time when I was not out to my parents, where I knew I was trans and I was not out to my parents, gosh, that was rough, a rough time period. So the mental toll that takes is significant. Another common objection here is that you need to change your mind, not your body.
I just want to point this out. This right here, this is the normative practice. I'm going to be logical for a second. So we're going to do theological, and just logical. I'm going to do the logical right now. Mind renewal, bringing our mind in alignment with our body, that is the normative practice in the medical field for all sorts of other issues. Think about this. If an anorexic 100-pound teenager walks into a doctor's office and says, hey, doctor, I weigh 100 pounds or 95 pounds. I feel like I'm overweight. A loving doctor would never say, well, you know what? If that's what your mind is telling you, then let's get you on diet pills, let's do liposuction, and let's have a stomach binding surgery. They would never do that. A loving doctor would go, hey, let's work on the mind to match the body instead of changing the body to match your mind.
This is completely incorrect. So science, medical science, doesn't care about whether or not you're working on the brain or the rest of the body, because, by the way, the brain is part of the body. The brain is an organ in the body. Medical science doesn't care what it changes. What medical science measures are results. They measure if something works. And transitioning for trans people works. That is a fact. It worked really well too. There's very low regret rates. This argument of eating disorders is a completely different thing, because it's a completely different problem, and a completely different thing works. What the research does is figure out what works for people with eating disorders, what works with people with bipolar disorder. There's all kinds of things. If you injure yourself, if you tear your ACL or something, you might need surgery. So like, there's plenty, like so many, heart surgery, open heart surgery. The reason they do that is because it works relative to the alternatives. And so that's what medical science cares about, is going after what works. So like, this is a completely bogus. This is a completely bogus argument, and really, really poorly thought through. Another thing that like the sticking point with my parents, actually. So like, all of that above, like all of those objections are all wrong. Like, those objections have no basis in reality, lowercase t truth. The one that's the sticking point for me and my parents, this is the one where the heartache for me really comes in. And my parents refusing to use my name and pronouns, and they have said to me, like, I told them, like, if you use my name and pronouns, I promise I will never think that that means that you think transitioning is okay, that my choices are okay. It wasn't good enough because other people might not know that. And so if they use my name and pronouns, it would communicate approval. The rejection that I feel from that, like, my parents do not approve of who I am at the core of my being. And you know how hard that is? It's as if my parents don't love me. They love some version of me that is in their head. And it is the hardest thing that I have ever experienced in my life. I've been through some shit. Like, but my parents not being able to talk to my parents is so hard. Them not seeing me for who I really am is so hard. And like, the thing that I want to say to them is, like, Jesus ate tax collectors and sinners. Does that mean he approved of them? That's bogus. Like, Jesus doesn't even follow this logic. And then like if they have a parent has a gay child and they have a boyfriend, does that mean that they approve and they call them a boyfriend? Does that mean that they approve of the relationship? Well, hell no. Like, nobody thinks that. And like, so what if somebody is confused and thinks you support trans people? You can easily clarify that. Like, it's not the end of the world. Like, I'm not asking you to broadcast the fact that you're using my name and pronouns. Nobody is. Like, I'm just asking you to use my now legal name and pronouns when you talk to me and when you talk to me around other people, which is gonna be rare. So I don't know. But there has to be a better way. There has to be a better way that we can, as a society, have Christians who have genuine, solid faith and atheists who don't, who are trans, to live in the same world next to each other with respect, and to talk and to share, like, talk about what we do have in common, like achieve common goals, like feeding the poor, getting people out of poverty, and educating people and teaching people, like helping people to live good lives. And we both disagree on what exactly that means, but there are some common threads that we can work towards. So is this emotional terrorism?
Some parents, you may have this sentence wielded at you, where somebody has said to you, you have to affirm your child's decision, or they'll, in this sentence, you can either have a living son or a dead daughter. Now, to that, I just need to firmly say that is a lie. All the stats that I just gave you show that that is a lie. In fact, some studies are now showing that rates are higher after gender-affirming care is given. But number two, can I just say this? That is emotional terrorism. That is emotional terrorism. Imagine if I came to Jana and I said, hey, Jana, babe, I'm so sorry. I've got these biological urges. And I can't stop wanting to sleep with other women. In fact, these urges are so strong, babe. If I can't act on these urges, I'm gonna kill myself. And so, hey, babe, you have two choices. You can either have a living adulterous husband, or you can have a dead monogamous one.
This case of name and pronouns that the pastor is talking about. Well, it depends. If I said to my parents, I'm going to kill myself if you don't use my name and pronouns, that is emotional terrorism. That is, a better word for it, really, honestly, is emotional blackmail. Like, emotional terrorism is like a broader category of things, but like, I'm blackmailing my parents if I say that to my parents. But if I'm not the one who's saying it, let's say a therapist is talking to my parents, and the therapist would be saying this in the context of, your kid, your child, is really struggling, and one of the huge contributing factors is the fact that you will not accept them, that you will not use their name and pronouns. And so if you do not use their name and pronouns, they will be successful. That is not emotional terrorism.
How did your behavior around that time impact Cody's mental health?
Cody's mental health went right down to the very, very pit of hell. Cody was in 4 different mental hospitals, and all of this, so anybody's watching, I did get permission to talk about all the things we're discussing today with my child. So he has been to 4 different mental hospitals, and it took the 4th mental hospital for me to figure things out. When Cody was in the hospital for the last time, and the social worker called and said, Jana, here's your options. You can either use his preferred name and pronouns, or next time he's going to succeed. I remember sitting in my kitchen table and I was rolling my eyes on the phone, and I said, fine. Put her, quotations, on the phone. Cody gets on the phone and I said something to the extent of, hey Cody, or hi Cody, or I don't remember exactly how the whole conversation started, but I used the name, and he just went, what? Silence, you know? We had a lot of repair work to do. He was very, very, very angry, and I was mad at him for disrespecting me as a parent. Isn't that funny? Even though I screwed up, God forbid me say that I'm sorry. But I will never forget when Cody finally came home and having him sit on my couch in my living room, and he wasn't talking to me yet. And I thought to myself at that point, I don't really care what gender you are anymore. You're breathing. You're on my couch. doesn't matter. The fight is done. I can't do it. And I prayed about it, and I said, Lord, why would you create somebody who isn't how you made them perfectly to be as they are right now? Why would you create somebody for me to shun them? It just started clicking. I'm like, wait a minute. My God wouldn't do that. My Jesus wouldn't ever tell somebody they couldn't go to church. My Jesus would never say, you can't love who you want to love. Isn't that the top thing in the Bible is love, isn't it? So it was that moment that I went, okay, and I pulled out of the church. And then I found all these wonderful affirming pastors on TikTok, and I thought, you can still love God and love your kid at the same time. How ironic.
That is communicating to the parents a reality. And this is so common. The rates are so high among unaccepted children of these unaccepting religious parents. Like, it is a reality that if you choose not to accept the name, not to use the name and pronouns of your child, you are significantly increasing the risk that they will commit and be successful. That's a reality. It is not terrorism. And it's kind of offensive that that's what he would say. And the pastor does give an example of actual emotional terrorism, of him saying to his wife, oh, like, you have to let me sleep around or I'm going to kill myself. That is emotional terrorism. If you want to support me, one of the best ways to support me right now is on my Patreon. You'll get early access to things. I will post community announcements there. I will do other things. Some of the higher tiers have some more benefits. I'm still working on it. It's still in development, but please check it out. Like, subscribe, do all that. But until next time, I love you all.